This is a special meeting of the State Board of Elections, and it's being live streamed for the public throughout the entirety of the meeting. It's also being recorded and will also be available for viewing after the meeting, with a link being made available on the board's website. So with that, let's start with the roll call, and I'll call each member, and if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great. I am, at least presently, the chairman, Ben Chandler, and I'm here. Do we have the Secretary of State, Michael Adams, with us?
Present.
Great. Sherry Whitehouse.
Yes, Sherry Whitehouse, Bullitt County member, present.
George Russell.
Yes, Franklin County member, present.
Deanna Brangers.
Yes, Jefferson County member, present.
Corey Skolnick.
Yes, Jefferson County member, present.
Katrina Fitzgerald.
Yes, County Clerk member.
And James Lewis.
Yes, retired County Clerk member.
Excellent. Well, we have a full complement of the board on the meeting, and thank you all for joining. We also have with us, I believe, General Counsel Taylor Brown, Assistant Director Karen Sellers, and Executive Director Jared Deering.
Present.
All right, as we go forward, if a member has a question, please announce yourself and your name, and I'll call on everybody one at a time. I've not done this before, so I don't know how smoothly this will go, but we'll try to do it as best we can and see if we can do what we can do to not talk over each other. Our ultimate goal today is to start the public conversation that will hopefully support both the Secretary of State and the governor in making the necessary legal recommendations and executive orders that'll require the state board to provide administrative policies and procedures in the upcoming election. And as you all know, the governor moved the election at the recommendation of the Secretary of State to June 23rd. It's not lost on anybody that we are in a bit of a crisis here in this state and in this country, and in fact in the whole world, as a result of the outbreak of the coronavirus. As a result of that, that has put us in a situation where elections are problematic in being able to run them, provide our citizens with access to the ballot, and at the same time, protect the citizens, the administrators, and the poll workers. In the judgment of a whole lot of us, the most important thing we can do is protect the safety of the people involved, both the citizens of the state and the people who work the polls in the election process. So to that end, what we have done is we have put together a work group. Secretary Adams and I talked about this, and we decided to put a work group together to talk about ways and means that we might start the conversation. The work group consisted of myself, Secretary Adams, member Corey Skolnick, member George Russell, the KCCA president, Renisa Abner. And Renisa, sorry I didn't introduce you. I know you're in the meeting as well. Hello.
I think she's currently on mute right now. When we have a report come in, she'll bring in.
Okay. And County Clerk from Kenton County, Gabriella Summey. Those were the members of the work group. The work group met, I believe, a couple of times and discussed multiple options. We also empowered the staff to do research necessary to see what other states were doing in putting together an election under these circumstances, and to try to come up with a plan that made sense for us under the circumstances that we face right now. And after discussing several options with, again, a mind toward doing two things: providing access to the ballot for the citizens of this state, number one. And number two, making sure that we ensure the safety of all the participants in the election. We came up with an option, and it we believe is a flexible framework of policies and procedures. But this is a starting point. And what we want to do here is have a conversation of the state board about whether this is a process that would work for those particular purposes. And with that, I would open it up to, well, you guys, I know, have received an executive summary of what the proposal to start the conversation is. And with that, I'd like to move on to open it up to some discussion. But first, I'd like to call on Secretary of State Adams to hear his thoughts on the subject.
Well, thank you, Ben. I especially want to thank you and the members of the work group and Jared for the work that we've already put in together. We've had good conversations, and I'm glad that we're having this meeting now for a couple of reasons. One is to have a fuller conversation with the rest of the board, and also to begin a conversation with the public, begin the process of getting public input on what they think we ought to do. I won't repeat all the things that have been said about what we've worked on and what we've discussed internally, and now are opening up to the whole board. I would like to add just a couple of points of background. On April 1st, the last day the legislature was in session before they adjourned for veto period, they passed emergency legislation that would explicitly permit this board to, upon the recommendation of me and the sign off of the governor, to develop procedures for an election in a state of emergency and to adjust not just the time or place, but the manner of the election. The reason they passed that legislation was to give us more explicit flexibility. We internally assessed what flexibility we already had under the current law. The sense was, and I'm speaking for myself, I think the sense was, well, arguably we've got some authority on our own to experiment a bit, but we'd be a bit vulnerable if there were a court challenge. So the purpose of this legislation, which by the way has not been signed by the governor yet, I'm hoping that it will be. As far as I know, he's supportive of it, but he hasn't signed it yet. But the purpose of this legislation is to explicitly permit not just the time and place of an election to be altered, but also the manner of the election. And that's intended to give us what we really need, which is flexibility. Another point, yesterday I secured $6 million in federal funds from the CARES Act. The federal stimulus package provides us $6 million in new federal funds, HAVA funds essentially, that can be used for costs over and above our usual election costs that can be tied to the coronavirus situation. And so what I would like for us to do, certainly I'm not going to try to run or otherwise significantly influence this meeting. I'm very dubious of the board feeling too much pressure from my office, given the recent history of that relationship. I want to hear what you all have to think. But I will tell you, I think there's an opportunity here to draw down these federal funds and buy things that will be beneficial to us regardless. For example, I think it would be very good for us to begin as soon as possible the process of procuring necessary supplies and equipment that can be used in the future if we find that we don't have to use it now. I think we're on the track that we're going to have to use it now. But for example, printing absentee ballot envelopes, certainly getting personal protective equipment, getting scanners. One of my policy goals, something I found bipartisan support for, is beginning the process of moving us toward a paper balloting system in Kentucky. And if we can use federal funds and tie that to the need to have scanners for an expected increase of voting by mail, absentee balloting by mail, that's something that we can hold on to and push toward eventually moving us toward a paper balloting system. So I I'm not here to advocate for permanent changes to our laws. We're really discussing only something that is unique to this situation. But I do think that we can take preparations now and think long-term, because certainly if November looks anything like June, it's going to be good to have these things on hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Adams. Can we hear now from the county clerk? The County Clerks Association, Renisa Abner is on the call, and she is the clerk of Henderson County, Kentucky, a great county in the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just on the call today to express the County Clerks Association gratitude for allowing us to be a part of this process. And I want to thank you all, the board members and the secretary, for having me today and allowing me to speak. And also for Jared, who has been in very close contact with our association and many members, and been very open to our opinions and our ideas and concerns. So I would just like to say that, I know the plan that the working group worked on and discussed at great length is something that the clerks are able to do. We just have a need for an expediency in the decision based on all of the things that we have to do in order to make an election happen. So, and that's with any election, lots of planning, lots of things to purchase, and lots of things to, a lot of procedures to put in place. And I know Jared and the State Board of Election is going to work on all of those. But that is our greatest need now, is to have a decision so we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Renisa. Appreciate it very much. And I think we understand that the county clerks have got to make this work. So it's a very difficult situation for you all to have to deal with. It's wholly out of the ordinary. And we want to try to come up with a solution that you all are happy with and that is workable. And of course, that's the goal of the state board right now. Jared, can you give us give us a discussion of what you've been up to relative to this problem and how the staff has gone about its business putting together a proposal?
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. So I think one, I'd like to start by saying that the current plan that we're discussing right now will be a starting point. It's a conversation starter. It's a way for us to be able to say that this is something that's been vetted through multiple perspectives and stakeholders. But more than anything, I think what we want to do is provide a support mechanism for both the secretary and the governor when they now take their part of this process and start to move forward with it, at which point it would then have to come back to the board. But I think kind of to the secretary's point, we want to have a public discussion, something that the public can then weigh in on, that the County Clerks Association has an opportunity to view. So if I could start maybe with just a general outline of the product that came from the work group and explain that to the board, and then maybe to open that up to the board for specific questions. Again, I know that this is not what's going to be the final product, but rather just kind of a starting point of discussion. So what the work group came up with, one, we reviewed multiple options and opportunities for dealing with the two stated main goals of the work group, which were A, to give access to every eligible voter to a ballot, but in doing so, not place them in danger or any harm for contracting COVID-19, specifically not just the voters, but also the poll workers and administrators. Doing that, we looked at what other states were doing. We looked at what different advocacy groups were putting forward. We looked at suggestions from the KCCA, the County Clerks Association, and what we came down to was an option that has several ways for voting and multiple forms of opportunity to be able to notify the voters of what that process looks like. And at the end, I think whatever the secretary and the governor come to a conclusion on, it's going to be incredibly important that we notify the voters of exactly how that's going to work, and messaging and informing the electorate will be incredibly important in that process. So at that point, the work group has discussed and is bringing forward two forms of voting. The first would be expanded absentee ballot application. In this process, it would still be a proactive process from the voter. This is not a vote by mail system. This is an absentee process in which the voter still has to proactively apply for an application, or rather apply for a ballot to be mailed to their address. There will still be the same checks and balances that we have for our absentees, including signature matching. We will be providing some extra resources to the clerks to help with that process, including ultimately giving the clerks the ability to not only better match signatures, but also have the ability to then notify voters that if there is a problem with their ballot, the signature didn't match, that there is an ability for that voter to be contacted in an efficient manner and have that voter be able to cure that signature. One of the things that we're looking at on the front side for the expanded absentee ballot process is the current process for applying for a ballot, for an absentee ballot, is a little cumbersome both for the voter as well as for the clerk. My biggest concern is on the clerk side. If that becomes a bottleneck, they would have a hard time being able to process the amount of volume that we would see from an expanded absentee process. So what myself and the IT team here at State Board of Elections have been working on is a web portal. It would work a lot like the online voter registration system, in which someone would have the ability to log in, provide us either their driver's license or their social security and their date of birth, verify that voter who they are. We would then bring up their address, their current location of where they're registered at. If they've moved, if they've not updated their voter information, we'll then redirect them back to the online voter registration portal that will give them an opportunity to update that information. If the information is correct, what we would then do is ask them to verify that that's the address they want that mailed to. We would then have them verify the information, making sure that it's correct, and then it would enter into the voter registration system, at which point the county clerk would have the ability to pull that information up in VRS. The county clerk is still going to be the agent that will approve these applications if this scenario moves forward. I think it was important for us to say from the state board's perspective that we want to provide resources, but not take authority over that. The county clerk being the jurisdictional authority at the county level is still a really good system, and we want to make sure that they have as much ownership as part of that process as possible. So much like the online voter registration system that the state maintains, that information is then aggregated and sent to the county clerk for the county clerk to approve. And this would be the same situation here with the application process, in which the voter has the ability to go to one website, log in, give us their information, and then submit that application, at which point the county clerk would then be able to pull it up on their side, determine whether or not that individual is eligible, and then move forward with processing the application and mailing it out. That takes away multiple steps for the county clerk. It makes it a little easier for the voter as well. I know in other states they're actually mailing out applications, but the problem with that, from our perspective in talking to many of the county clerks, is that the voters would then fill that information out, mail that back to the clerks, and now the clerks not only have to process the ballot out, but they also have to process the application in. And so if we can help that with streamlining the process, both for the voter as well as the county clerk, we'll be able to process a much higher volume of these ballots. The second part of this voting process will be in-person voting through the absentee process by appointment. Again, this is a starting point. It's not the final product. This is still going to have to go through multiple stages of vetting, including the secretary determining if this is the direction that the state needs to go in. But I think the goal here is to provide this starting point that we can have a full discussion on, give as much support to the secretary and the governor as we possibly can, and then they can make informed judgments based on that. The goal with in-person voting in the county clerk's office by appointment is that we try to limit it as much as possible to voters who have disabilities or voters without mail service. What we find in these two populations, one, there's a federal law that states that in-person voting must be accessible for the disability community. But we also want to maintain opportunities for voters who don't necessarily have mail service. So individuals that might be homeless, individuals who live in very rural areas and oftentimes don't have addresses, we want to make sure that they're not left out of this process. So the goal is by doing appointment and spreading that out over time, we can provide the county clerks the ability to spread out and maintain a level of social distancing that we're seeing in other states is being hard to meet. If you have an open voting process like that, and at least in the current state of affairs for COVID-19, what we're seeing is voters who show up to the voting center and then they congregate outside. They, have not as much opportunity to have social distancing at that point. But then when they get in the clerk's office or the voting polling center, they then enact social distancing. So we've lost that ability to kind of keep that population safe when that. So the goal here is to spread that as much as possible, to limit as much of that as possible to voters who have true accessibility needs, as well as voters without mail service. But the goal at the end of the day is to really give both voters and clerks the ability to do this safely, to vote and cast their vote safely, and to do so in a meaningful way. But I will also say that this plan is not necessarily a compromise of ideas, but rather a synthesis of ideas. What I mean by that is that we're taking opportunities and policies and procedures from all areas that we feel would enhance the ability of this election to be free, fair, and safe. And one of those is that we can expand the ability of signature matching on the backside for absentee ballots. One of the things that we can provide for is the ability for county clerks to be able to add bar scans to the outer envelope. This won't be an ID or be able to identify the ballot itself, but rather just the envelope and the voter next to the signature. That will allow the clerk to be able to use a bar scan code to be able to pull that individual up in the voter registration system and be able to directly match that signature right then and there. It'll add a lot of streamlining for the clerk's processes. And at the end of the day, it'll also give the voter registration system, which is a fairly flexible platform, the ability to track those individuals from the perspective of whether their ballot was received, whether the signature was matched, and if it wasn't, help aid the clerks in contacting those voters, giving them an opportunity to cure that signature match. So ultimately, what we're looking for here is a safe election, but also a secure election. And ultimately, that's what's going to give the voters the confidence in knowing that their ballot will be counted appropriately, correctly, but that they still also have access to that ballot and doing so safely.
Jared,
Please.
could you also discuss the drop-off piece of it, and after that, the timing, the importance of timing on this thing?
Certainly. So several of the other options, and again, I think Ben said this when we started out, this is a flexible framework. Not only are we providing a piece of support document that we can give to the secretary and the governor for them to work on their side, but it's also a way for us to have flexibility, because as everyone knows, the situation with COVID-19 is changing daily and weekly. What we need is a flexible framework that will allow us to move forward with the election, and with some understanding that if things get worse, we can make things more flexible to secure the safety and health side. But if things get better, there's also opportunity for increased in-person voting in a safe manner. So one of the ways that we're looking at decreasing interaction with the county clerks and the poll workers is a drop-off process. Again, this is a very broad policy that can still be worked on. One of the things that we're thinking about is having secure drop boxes. These are drop boxes that are specifically made for voting. They're incredibly secure. They will be mounted in front of the county clerk's office or in a location that is also secure and visible. This will allow voters that don't want to put this back in the mail and want to deliver it directly an opportunity to drive down to the county courthouse and drop it off in that box. And again, they're doing so in a way that is not having direct interaction with the administrator at that point, or with other voters. So that is one opportunity that we also have. We're also talking about drive-up ballot pickup. So for voters that might not have mail service, this is an opportunity to keep them from having to necessarily interact directly with the clerk or going in and using a voting system, taking away an opportunity for someone that has true accessibility needs to be able to use that. So the idea here would be that the individual could call the county clerk, be able to show who they are, prove their identification under our current laws and statutes. And that clerk will then have a ballot ready for that person to pick up at curbside. This is not curbside voting by any stretch of the imagination. It's rather just a way for the clerk to be able to process that ballot to that voter when that voter needs it, and then hand that over to them. Some of the timing that we're looking at on this is because of the potential increased volume of return absentee. We would need more time on the front side of the election for the clerks to process that, and also time after the election as well. One of the things that we're looking at right now is what an appropriate time frame would be. We've been discussing this with other states that have a larger absentee mail-in system or a vote by mail system, and how they process that scale or volume of ballots when they come in. Our belief is we would probably need to provide the counties with extra scanners on some circumstances, but also provide them extra time. And one of the ways in which we're suggesting that is having the county boards have the ability to appoint a processing committee. So one, they would keep party parity. So that's an important part of that process. But these are individuals that the county board can rely on to come in on a daily basis and work for the county clerk and the county board in helping to process these ballots and applications. On the front side, for the application side, when you have to stuff hundreds and if not thousands of ballots and then mail them out, that's a pretty arduous process for the county clerks if they don't have the appropriate staff. And two, when the ballots come back, we're doing signature matching. That's also going to need extra staffing, and then also in the processing and tabulation of the ballots. So if we're looking at several weeks prior to the election for the clerks to have that opportunity to be able to start the process of tabulating those, again, we'll do this in a secure way, that the ballots are being cared for and a process that is governed and oversight is had by both party officials at the board level, as well as these processing committees and the clerk side. Ballot security will be, again, that's not something we're changing. We're just keeping the current processes we have in place and expecting the clerks to hold to that. The tabulation of the vote count will not be public until election day. But then what we're also seeing from other states is there's going to be a necessary need to have several days after the election for the clerks to be able to receive those ballots that come in the last several days up to the election, including voters who cast their ballot on election day, and give the clerks time to process those ballots, both of the tabulation side as well as the signature cure side. We've seen several lawsuits that if there's not a signature cure, that those lawsuits that have gone through have the state has lost those if they don't have some meaningful signature cure process. And I think that's not just important from a legal standpoint, but also just to ensure that we're not disenfranchising voters, but also that it's maintaining a level of security to the election as well. So if we're looking at timeframes, we're looking at several weeks prior to the election for them to be able to tabulate, in a week after the election, roughly. Again, these are starting points, open for discussion. And then some of the other timeframes that we're looking at right now will be in the importance of purchasing some of our equipment, both scanners and ballot marking devices for some of our counties that are using paperless systems or e-slates or DREs. And then we're also going to need to print a large volume of ballots for those DRE counties that don't currently print ballots because they expect so much of their voters to be able to print on electronic systems. But we also need to print a fairly significant amount of ballot envelopes. So there are 3 ballot envelopes that go out. There's the inner security envelope, which is where the voter places their ballot and signs the outside. There's the outer envelope that the voter mails that back in. And then there's the inner envelope that the voter mails it back to the clerk in. And then there's the outer envelope that the clerk mails that full packet to the voter in. So in order to make sure that we have the necessary supplies, my recommendation to the board is that while this is absolutely a starting point, much like the secretary said, that we're going to see some expanded absentee usage just because of the current situation. So we want to be prepared for that. And worst case scenario here is that if things turn out to be better than they are, or we have a different system that is not accommodating the necessary volume that we're looking at for absentee mail, we still have ballots left over that we'll be able to utilize at the county level. So it won't be a waste of money, but I definitely think it's in the best interest of the Commonwealth to start purchasing these necessary supplies and equipment as we start.
Thank you,
Can I ask a
Jared.
quick question? Can I ask a quick
Dwight,
question, Mr. Chairman?
yes,
As far as the
Dwight.
web portal goes, playing devil's advocate here on our web portal, if we have 3.4 million, which is not going to happen, but if we have 3.4 million logging in at the same time, is there any concern of it crashing? We've seen some issues with the SBA loan processes and things of that nature. So just curious if that could be a concern as well.
So I think it's important to note that one, the plan is if we adopted this model, and again, I really want to preface the fact that these are starting points, not ending points. But if we did operate models similar to this, that we would mail out a postcard to every single voter. The postcard would state that there is a website for you to log on to be able to apply for your application. It would also have a phone number for the county clerk's office. That way, we're also ensuring that voters who don't have internet or a computer have the ability to call on the county clerk, and the county clerk will then help them process that application appropriately. And then we would also have in-person instructions as well. So what our assumption is that of the 3.4 million people that we mail those to, one, we're currently in the process of cleaning our rolls and making sure we have accurate addresses on individuals. I see this being a benefit on two ways. One, it's going to help us in the continuation of cleaning our voter rolls and making sure that we have accurate addresses on every individual in the system. And part of that process will be that as they log in to apply for the application, we're going to have them verify that their address is up to date and current. And if it's not, we're going to give them a process and a way to move into the online voter registration system to do that. And two, when those, our expectation of the 3.4 million postcards that go out, we would expect to see voter turnout roughly the same. Because again, there is a proactive nature to this process. The voter still has to take an action to apply for this absentee application, or absentee ballot rather. And what we expect is in similar actions that we see in other states that have similar models. So my feeling is that we would see probably less than 50% of turnout. We would probably have to scale to answer your question specifically. We would probably have to scale our systems up for several weeks prior to the postcard going out, and after the postcard hits, that would probably when we would see the most volume coming into that system. But it's definitely something I think we could handle. And again, this is not a processing system in which we are approving or denying the application, but rather aggregating the data and then flowing that down to the county clerk side to process. So we're distributing out much of the work down to the clerk side. But from the point of view of having 3.4 million people log in at the exact same time, there's not too many systems that can handle that. We would get pretty close, but my expectation is that we wouldn't have 3.4 million logging in. And of the individuals that do that, they would be spread out over a period of time. So I don't think it's going to be a significant problem for the system.
Chairman Chandler got a question.
Yes, James Lewis.
Yes, Jared, on some of the mechanics of the absentee process, envelope process, from application to actually counting. First of all, the applications process through the state system. Will those applications, I guess, electronically be sent to the clerk? I know they're going to be notified, but will the application itself actually be available? Because the county clerks will have to turn those over to the grand jury in their report after the election. Second, on the signature verification, the process that you're telling us that will be a great help, I think, for verification. But I'm assuming the county clerk will have discretion as if it's not a match on your scan system, they would have some, I would think, discretion because they are by statute the person who verifies the signature. And that could be an important point because a lot of people do, their signature has changed since the one that we have on file, for example, because the last re-registration was in '73, I think. Some of those signatures still exist, and I know all of our writings change over the years. Mine has. The in-person application and voting that's going to take place at the clerk's office under this proposal. I'm hoping the board will have a lot of flexibility in being able to designate spots other than the courthouse because of the volume that it could increase, especially in small offices where you only have 4 or 5 workers and don't have the space to handle those situations. Good. And the deadline for receiving the ballot, currently, of course, we know what it is, 6 p.m. on election day. And it sounds like this is something you want to extend and delay the results of the election for a week or something to that effect under this proposal, correct?
So let me, if I can, let me answer all 3 of your questions, and I'll maybe if I go in reverse. So to answer your last question, so what we're seeing is the potential for clerks not having the ability on election day to be able to finish that process effectively, not to mention the fact that the individuals who mail their ballots in on election day and they arrive, but they still, like, if that signature doesn't match, they still have to have an ability to be able to cure that signature. So what we're proposing is the opportunity for, one, election night, we can state, and this is open for discussion, obviously, all these things are open for discussion. We can open that election night results up and say, these are the election results as they are currently tabulated, giving partial results, but being very clear to the general public that the process is not completed yet, and we still have a number of ballots that we're continuing to process. At which point, the thought here is that we could give voters until Friday to cure their signature. That's a reasonable amount of time, 3 days, to be able to notify the voter and then have them come in and provide information or proof of identification. And then the clerks and the county boards would have to send their SBE 49A forms to the Secretary of State by the following Tuesday. So at close of business or at 6 p.m. if we just want to have an even week. At which point then we would, as a board, we would post those results officially or having come in, and then we would make them official once the board certifies them after they're presented by the Secretary of State. What other states do when they're processing this many ballots is they have this extra time frame, and most of those states also provide election night results, but do so in a way that notifies the general public that these are temporary results of a non-permanent process that is ongoing and will continue to update the electorate as we finish the process. My recommendation is we would have some similar process to that. At the very minimum, we'll still need to provide voters an opportunity to cure signatures in that process. Your second question about space and kind of what happens. I know you yourself, many elections, we had to approve your ability to have an election system just outside your hallway because of the lack of space you had in your courthouse. What we're going to recommend is that we're not going to dictate where the clerk puts this, but rather give them the flexibility of selecting an appropriate venue. So appropriate meaning that there's accessibility needs that need to be met, that they're ADA compliant, but that they're also doing it in a way that is not putting their staff at risk or voters at risk. So I just had a conversation with a clerk a couple of days ago that they were asking a very similar question. And I recommended to them, if you contacted your county judge executive and asked them for a room, a conference room, some sort of office space that's in the courthouse, do you think they would be able to provide that for you? We could, put cameras in there to make sure that it's a safe place for the storage of ballots, that we can create some security around that location. And their response to me was yes, that they could do that. Now, not every county courthouse will have a space like that, but my belief is that every county clerk would have the ability to find a location in the county that would suffice for all the necessary needs that we would have for a balloting location, or a polling location, rather, for in-person voting. As far as signatures are concerned, for the process here is that the county board is still has a ministerial role over the processing of those signatures. So because we can't expect a county board to be in session for weeks leading up to the election, the goal would be for them to appoint a processing committee. And we're having some discussions about how we would pay for that and providing resources to the counties, including possibly having other state employees that live and reside in that county, that we could ask the governor to retask them towards election systems, as long as the clerk has the process to hire those individuals and select from an appropriate group, the county board rather. So at that point, the county board is still officially the one that will approve those signatures. The processing committee might pull the signatures that they think are not viable, or for whatever reason don't match, and then start the process of notifying the voter, giving that voter time. So much like you said, voter signatures change over time. Especially what we see statistically is that the very old and the very young. So oftentimes the young, their signatures are changing every couple of months, if not, they're just kind of not solidified in what that signature looks like. And for the old, oftentimes we're seeing that signature over 20, 30 years will absolutely change. So one of the goals here would be to streamline the process for both the voter and the clerk and the county board. So one, recognizing the signatures that are authentic, being able to push those through and process them, and then other signatures that they feel that they have a problem with. Ultimately, the county board will still be the final adjudicator for those signatures, but there's a way for that processing committee to notify the voter prior to that process, giving the voter time to come in and cure that signature before the board has to make a final decision.
Jared, another point on the counting process of the absentee ballots. Current law allows for a county board member to challenge an absentee ballot once that name is called. How's that going to be handled in this process?
So the thought process here, and again, none of these are processes that are solidified. Like,
yeah,
there's
I know.
a lot of room here to be able to negotiate these out and discuss how that works. And one of the important things that we're hoping to look at, and I know this is the working group's thought process as well, is that what we want to do is provide some broad strokes of how this might work, and then work with the County Clerks Association and the secretary and the governor to make sure that the steps that we're taking are appropriate and legal, but also doable, right? Just because we can make it appropriate or legal does not make it actually feasible from the perspective of the county clerk's office. So the thought there in that process would be the county clerk still has that ability to challenge, and they are the ones that will be helping to supervise the processing committee. Again, the board would be the one to appoint the processing committee, so that the board still has a very active role in determining that there's a checks and balance there. But then the clerk would still be the one that would be overseeing that as the chair of their board.
Any other questions from members of the board?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. This is George.
Thank you, George.
I've got 2 or 3 comments. One, so we are suggesting 6 p.m. election day is the final time to drop off a ballot or receive a ballot. Is that correct?
Again, I think that's open for discussion, but I think that the current plan that the work group was working on, the final time to drop a ballot off would be at 6 p.m. local. Yes.
Okay. Something for future discussions. The postcard that is mailed out, because all of us agree there are some bad addresses on our statewide voter registration list. There are people that now live in other states. Should this postcard be able to be forwarded to another address or returned to the State Board of Election? That's one thing we need to discuss. Another thing we need to discuss is once a voter has applied for an absentee ballot, is that public information? And what I mean by that, people that run campaigns, can they come in and get a list of everyone who has applied for an absentee ballot? I hope not, but is that public information? A third thing I think we need to discuss, and this is a more of a county clerk's issue, when a voter marks incorrectly their ballot and the voter realizes it before it mails in, what is the process to get a replacement ballot? And that's some points for discussion issues in the future. Am I clear?
Yes, thanks, George. Appreciate that.
Okay.
Chairman Chandler, do you want to move the discussion, or you want me to answer that, or how do you want to do that?
Well, if you can answer that very briefly, Jared, but I think those are the kinds of details that I think would be the staff would be working on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and yeah, to your point, to me that's why we're talking about a broad framework right now. But some of these very detailed policy processes would have to be something that we continue to work out and make sure that all the details are kind of hammered out. But off the top of the process, I don't want to change as much as possible, right? The idea with this plan that I think that the county clerks have thought through, and what the working group kind of thought through, was the idea that this plan, while on the exterior it looks like an incredibly different process for the voters, and for the voters in many respects it will be. However, for the county clerks, every county clerk currently processes absentee ballots, and we want to change that process as little as possible for the county clerk side. We want to streamline what we can streamline, but leave security where we can leave security, leave that checks and balance process that's currently there that gives us confidence that when absentee ballots are sent in, they're being sent in appropriately and counted correctly. So the tracking process will still kind of remain, if not maybe beef that up a little bit. George, to your question about whether or not the absentee list will be public or not, I think that's a conversation for further research. My guess is, to your point, I don't necessarily think it would be appropriate, but that's for the board and the secretary and the governor to decide, I think, at that point. I think the goal here is, if we can provide the secretary with this flexible framework, that he can fill in some of these more details that have the ability to secure the election, to provide us resources will be something the governor's going to have to step in for, and what those resources look like. So George, I think to shortly answer your question is that I think those are things that we're still going to have to continue to work on as we move forward.
Jared, could I clarify
James?
something? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, statutorily, currently, you cannot release a list until 6 p.m. on election day of people who have received absentee ballots.
Yeah.
Unless that statute is discarded, there's already statutory protection for that.
That's right.
On the and casting a vote, administrative regs set by the state board now addresses that, and actually instructions are sent with the ballot on how to correct their misvote and to make sure that the board knows which one wants to be counted. So those are things that, unless they're discarded, they're already in practice and have been for some time.
And I think that would be the goal here, is to make sure that those things aren't discarded, right? We don't want to change the process so much so that we're confusing clerks or confusing voters. Voters have used absentee ballots in the past. Not everyone has done that, but many are familiar with it. But the clerks are absolutely familiar with the process. And I think that including these processes that keep security at the forefront of the election is just as important as making sure that eligibility and access to the ballot is also there, right? That's part of that idea where I'm talking about synthesis of ideas and not compromise of ideas. So, if we can ensure that it's still safe to request a ballot, but also secure, I think this is how the election will best be facilitated.
Mr.
All
Chairman,
right.
this is Corey Skolnick. May I share a few comments?
Yes, Corey, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was a member of the working group, so I wanted to share a couple of observations from that group and then make a couple of points based on what we've heard today. First, I want to thank you, Jared, and also the Secretary for all your hard work. I know that we're having this discussion today because you and your staff have given this a lot of thought, and I think it's an important discussion to have. I also want to note that the working group was a very collaborative, collegial group, everybody with the goal of creating, I think the key word here is flexibility, that we don't know what it's going to be like in June, and we do realize there's planning that needs to occur. So the goal was to create flexibility for the secretary and the clerks and those who need to actually implement and administer the elections. And I think it is important to continue in that collaborative spirit. But I do think the secretary plays a key role here. My understanding of the new law is that we only get to the point where we have these types of regulations if he requests it of the governor. And so while I appreciate his comments at the outset that he didn't want to be viewed as twisting this discussion to go in the direction of his prerogatives, I do think it's important that he voiced for us, his views as we move forward, so we make sure that we're on a positive track. The other comments I'll make is that these are ideas. This is flexibility. There were no, decisions made at the committee level, the subcommittee level, and I just want to tell that to all of the other individual members of the State Board of Elections. You have as much of a role in this as any of us who were on that subcommittee. What we tried to do is put together a menu of options that could be available and planned for if needed. So, if I was in your position and not on that subcommittee, I would maybe want to hear that reassurance that, your perspective is just as important as any of us who were. The only substantive comment I have is, while I agree that we should take an action here limited to whatever emergency situation we're in other words, I don't think that this emergency is an opportunity to try to reform Kentucky's election laws more generally, but should be narrowed to what we need this year. That I do think that there is something a little bit different about what I'll call emergency absentee ballot voting, which is that, absentee ballots, unlike a machine, do require human interaction. They require people to make decisions. They require challenges in some instances. And so I do think part of our conversation needs to be a set of procedures on the back end that allows the parties or candidate observers to make sure that they have a role in observing the counting of the absentee ballots, so that we can ensure not only the security, but the validity of votes that might be counted, because I do know that there are some differences in how counties treat and count absentee ballots now in terms of how they look at signatures or don't look at signatures. And so while I agree with you, Jared, wholeheartedly, we want to keep it as much the same as possible, and I believe that philosophically too, I do think that there's going to need to be enhanced observation, and we probably need to consult with the parties and candidates about how that can happen. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Corey, for those comments. And I'd like to second what you said about the working group. It really was the intent of the working group to essentially start the conversation, to put together some ideas, a general framework that we thought we could start the conversation around. And that's what we've done. No decisions have been made. This entire board will have to make recommendations, or we feel like we should make recommendations to the secretary and to the governor. But we all, I think, understand that with the law written as it's written now, the secretary and the governor have got to ultimately decide what the manner of the election will be. There are a lot of unusual circumstances here, and I think it's also important to point out, as you did, that this is a one-off. This is an emergency situation that is unlike anything that we've ever faced before. And the intent of what we're doing is to meet that emergency, not to change laws going forward, but to meet this particular individual unique emergency.
And I would, if I could, Chairman, to also follow up on that, especially from Corey's perspective, I think that the ability for us to do this in a way that, you know, adds safety and also security and value to the voters, but also, you know, like I have to say that I am incredibly proud to be a Kentuckian right now. That, like, you know, this process for us has been, you know, very smooth, very collegial. To your point, Corey, that, you know, we've got individuals from multiple parties, both on this board, the governor of one party affiliation, the secretary of another, and you know, what I think we're seeing is an interest to want to reform the emergency, not the election, right? So if we can add value to the process now in a temporary way that solves for the current conditions, I think that's probably the most appropriate thing that we could possibly do. But in no way is this a way for us to reform future elections. Every election moving forward will have to be evaluated in its own state at the time that that election takes place. So I think, you know, I want to make it clear that what we're talking about right now is the primary election, and we're not talking about anything else. So I want to make sure that's clear when the board has future discussions about this.
Does anybody else have any comment or question?
Yes, Chairman, it's Member Chairman, this is Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry. Go ahead.
Yes, and so what I'm hearing is, you know, that there has been a ton of work, and again, just to, you know, everyone that, just to repeat that, you know, just thankful that so much work is going on in the background to just ensure that all of our voters across the state will be able to feel confident in our June election. And we are in uncharted territory, so it's just refreshing to know that we're being proactive and doing everything we can. One suggestion that I wanted to bring up was, you know, have we looked at the military portal that the previous secretary had implemented that, you know, takes away a lot of the issues of, you know, people having to be in person. So that's just a suggestion. I don't know all the back end side of that, but there's that process. I'm always curious about those in place processes that are working that we could implement or grow for this, you know, situation. Also, I am in agreement with Corey that I'm really looking towards our secretary to provide that input. I have a great deal of trust in our new secretary, and you know, would love to follow his input as far as what his thoughts are going forward. We definitely want to support that, and just feel really confident that, you know, from this board meeting that we're going to be able to support each other and come together and do all we can. We all know that this is, like we said, uncharted, and we're trying to do our best. And my goal is always due diligence. So my hope is that through all this, we can come up with a plan and move forward. I'm also have great trust in our clerks. We have a couple, you know, people, 2 or 3 here on this meeting that, you know, just making sure on that back side that all this can be handled. Jared, to your point, the computer systems, you know, and coming up with this system to handle this processing in an emergency situation. I know the difficulty of that, and just want to, you know, do we have those systems in place? Are we already looking at those things? So these are just suggestions proactively that, you know, I want to make sure that all of our voters across the state of Kentucky has confidence in what we're doing and trying to do.
Thank you for those comments, Sherry. Jared, would you like to address the military portal question?
Sure, and not to let this become a distraction to the overall conversation, but we looked at the portal that was presented to us. It's basically a front end framework. It's a visual website, but there's no back end to it. So it was, I think, presented before it was completed, and that's kind of what it looks like right now. And even if that was the case, part of the problem if we move to a system like the military and overseas voting portal, even the one that we currently have that stood up, it doesn't give a uniform way for the voters to have a ballot that when they send that back to the clerks can then use optical scan readers to process those ballots. What you end up with is, ballots that aren't necessarily uniform in their size and their printing. And so it becomes a very much of a bottleneck on the backside for the clerk. So the part of the goal was to keep as many of the resources we have in play right now, while also not, putting things at risk because we're forcing things in a way that would push technology past a point that, it's available. So one, to specifically answer your question, that portal that was presented is not something that would be viable. We'll continue to look at it, but it like I said, there's no back end to that. And it doesn't make any ties to anything. And there's not a back end security process for the voters as well, or the administrators for that matter. But to move forward, one of the things that we are looking at is the county clerks have, for the majority of the counties, have already printed all their ballots because they were prepared and ready for the May 19th primary before it was moved. And so one of the things that the work group was uniformly agreed on is that the counties continue to use those ballots as have already been printed, because we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not, coming into the six figures or seven figures for the replacement of those ballots. So we can keep those ballots as are. We'll use those as the absentee ballots if we do go down this road. But using a portal in which you would have ununiform ballot processing on the backside would really make it difficult for tabulating ballot counts. As far as our technology is concerned, so myself and Tom Watson, our senior architect, about a month ago, we kind of saw the writing on the wall and knew that if we started the process then and started making this portal available, that we would have the ability to stand it up if it was needed. And if it's not needed, then that's okay. Then we can put it aside and, continue to allow the process to move on as it is. But, I'm going to request of the board an ability to be able to start purchasing some of the equipment we'll need. And I'll make that very clear of kind of what that looks like and ask for your permission and a vote for that. But in the same kind of context, Tom and I, we wanted to take a look at this and say, hey, in a month or 2 months, will we be able to stand up a platform that will facilitate the needs of the voters, facilitate the needs of the clerks, be secure, be stable, be resilient and robust? And that's kind of what we're looking at right now. We're still in the middle of that process. The main architecture is completely done, but we're still kind of working on the GUI right now, or the user interface, and what that's going to look like. But we are confident right now that it's a system that will work and will be secure and robust. So to that point, I definitely see where you're coming from, that, this is not the usual time frame in which you stand up software solutions to problems, but it's definitely something I think we have the ability to do and do appropriately.
Okay, thank you, Jared. We have heard from everybody except Deanna and Katrina, I believe. Do either one of you all have any thoughts on this?
Well, I always have a thought or two.
Well, we've been anxious to hear it, Deanna.
Well, one of my big concerns, and James actually kind of addressed it earlier, is, we have a lot of county clerks that aren't even have their offices open right now, and they're in very tight quarters. And as Jared mentioned, there's, maybe not facilities available in their courthouse, and they're not able to, do basic functions right now. And then if you're talking an increased volume of ballots that are having to be hand processed, I just think we've got to really be very hands-on as we're moving forward, no matter what changes that we're making, to support them. Because, a county like Jefferson's going to have far more resources available to spread out and to do things versus a smaller county. And so those are just some of the concerns that I have right now. And I don't have the answers or things that I think I've still got to try to think through as we're, having these discussions. But my concern is, how do we support, basically, if we go to a more expanded absentee voting process, the workload that we are, going to create. Not saying we're not going to have to create it, but we've got to figure out how we support it.
Thank you for that. Katrina, any thoughts you might have?
No, I think you all have covered all the thoughts.
Okay, great. Let me ask this question. Is there general support for the overall framework? Understanding that there are details that have to be worked out. But given the fact that we've got, I think, general agreement on the notion that we want to provide access to the ballot to the people of Kentucky, and we want to make sure that we ensure the safety of everybody involved, does this framework in general comport with those goals? And are you all in general agreement with moving forward on this kind of framework, understanding that there are details within it that will need to be worked out along the way?
Hey, can I jump in, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please do, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. I've tried to balance between not being too aggressive, but also not totally heightening my cards. I wanted to actually hear what everybody had to say, get a full airing of everybody's views before I said anything. But I certainly don't want y'all to take an action and then be in conflict with my own position if that's not necessary. That wouldn't be fair to anybody. So here's where I am. Number one, I think this plan is very thoughtful, very detailed and meticulous. Clearly a lot of effort has gone into this. I think it's an excellent starting point. I'll tell you the parts that I'm more comfortable with and the parts I'm less comfortable with. I certainly think that even if we didn't change a single thing legally or by regulation, we would have a massive expansion of people voting absentee by mail. It's just the reality. It's people's natural reaction to the situation we have. And they wouldn't be especially concerned about which exception they fell under. They'd come up with something and they'd vote by mail. So I think certainly we have to prepare for an expansion of people voting that way. But I also don't think that it's necessary to make people liars. I think it's appropriate for us, assuming the governor signs this new legislation, for us to take advantage of it and provide more legal clarity that it's okay for people to vote by mail under these circumstances. I think the most limited way, I think a couple of members have said this point, to the degree we can do this with a light touch, that's preferable. I think the lightest touch to do this would be for us to use this new authority to clarify that the medical emergency exception that currently exists by statute will be deemed by the board to apply to the current situation. What I like about that is it's an interpretation of the existing law. It's a very light touch. I think we should do a couple of things. Number one, we should clarify that you don't personally have to have coronavirus to benefit from the medical emergency exception. You simply recognize that there is a medical emergency and that you have a reasonable risk of infection if you vote in person, or perceive that you may. I do think that we would need to suspend the requirement that absentee ballot request be notarized, which is what current law provides. That's, I think, the lightest touch to expanding absentee voting. It's the least deviation from current law, but I think would have the effect of making people more comfortable legally utilizing this approach. I think we should certainly plan, regardless of whether we effectuate that, to expect a significant expansion of voting by absentee ballot by mail. But that would make it a lot cleaner and simpler and easier, I think, for everybody. I'm very comfortable with that approach. I'm a little less comfortable with the notion, at least as of today, or maybe even a week from now or 2 weeks from now, of deciding in early to mid-April that we're definitely not going to have election day as typically configured on June 23rd. I certainly think that we need to plan around having fewer voting locations, very aggressively consolidating the voting locations, just because we're not going to be able to find the poll workers. Even if everything miraculously cleared up in April, I think the nation's psyche is wounded enough that we're not going to be able to find people. 16,000 poll workers, of whom 9,000 are age 65 or over, that we're going to be able to recruit these people for business as usual. So I do think that we need to significantly reduce the number of polling locations and provide for social distancing in that process. I'm not currently comfortable with literally abolishing in-person voting other than by appointment or for certain types of voters, disabled or homeless. I think there might be some litigation exposure there. Number one, under our state constitution, which envisions voting at the polls, I don't think we can completely eliminate it. And number two, if we treat some classes of voters differently from others, we might have exposure there. So what I would like us to think through also is expanding absentee voting and having an in-person component and a mail component at the voter's choice, but having extra days of early voting, which I think would take some of the pressure off long lines at the polling sites and make it easier to have social distancing if we can space out election day over a longer period of time versus doing it on one day. I think if we do that, and I know this is really an academic discussion, I don't have stats behind this at this point, but I think if we're able to do that, we can still have a traditional election, sort of, with people voting in person and avoid that litigation exposure, and also have fewer of these votes coming in by mail and ultimately have results concluded more quickly. So those are my initial thoughts. One last point, the plan that we're discussing as an initial venture, I could certainly live with it if it's a last resort and we conclude that we simply cannot function otherwise. The last thing I want is to see what we've seen in a couple other states. I won't pick on anybody, but I don't want to have poll workers putting on hazmat suits and being in fear of their lives. I don't want voters to feel the same way. I don't want a destabilization of our democracy via people being panicked about coming to the polls or in fear of their lives if they do. So I think we've got some great suggestions here. The other thing I'm not quite there yet on is the drop boxes. Again, it is a last resort. I think I could accept it, but right now I have a lot of concerns about what that looks like and ensuring ballot integrity there. So I would only be comfortable there if we conclude that we simply can't do otherwise. But I certainly want to avoid the sort of Mexican standoff that you've seen in other states where you have the governor and the secretary and the board and the courts all at odds and election day off and then on and off again. That would be a nightmare. So, fortunately, we've had the pleasure of going late now in the process and getting to see what other states have done and see what does and doesn't work. I think what we're talking about is a great approach. My own preference, until persuaded otherwise, and my mind is completely open. But right now, my view is I'd like to have expanded voting by mail absentee under these circumstances, but also expanded in-person voting absentee spaced out over time to make the social distance easy.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, Mr. Secretary. I think you'll have general agreement from most everybody that if this is undertaken, it would be seen as essentially a last resort. I don't think anybody is happy about the circumstances. I don't think anybody wants to change the manner or mode of our elections. I think everybody's first choice would be to have an election as normal. The same way we've always done it through the processes that are there in the statutes. I think we understand that this is an emergency situation. It's hopefully a once in a lifetime situation. Hopefully we won't have to deal with this too many other times in the future. I don't think our society can handle it, but it's important, I think, if we do want to actuate this last resort option, that we take some actions early on, just because of the administrative requirements necessary to have a smooth election under this plan. There's certain things that have to be done, whether we end up going with the plan or not in the final analysis, depending on the circumstances. And of course, I would suggest that we make a decision about in-person voting based on the recommendations of the public health officials here in Kentucky. I think that's really the most appropriate thing, is to follow the recommendations of the public health officials. But it's extremely important for
us to have the safety of the voters. And I understand that you certainly feel that way as well. And your point about the poll workers, I think, is absolutely accurate. That even under the best case scenario, we're not going to have sufficient poll workers at this point. So with that, I would ask Jared to let us know what needs to be undertaken right away. Jared, is there anything that we need to do to give the staff permission, the go ahead to go ahead and get done those steps that need to be done now, so that this plan can be effected if necessary?
Certainly. Thanks, Chairman. Appreciate it. Following, Secretary Adams' kind of lead on this, that the process here is still ongoing, and that we're looking for a best outcome here. My hope here is that I can ask the board for permission, and you'll probably have to take a vote on this, not to enact the plan, not to enact any finality to the process that we've been talking about right now. Again, that has to go back to the Secretary of State and the governor and their responsibility in this process and the first steps that have to be taken. But in order for us to notify to the general public, notify to the county clerks that we're taking the appropriate steps to put us in a position to be successful, I need permission from the board to start releasing resources and purchasing equipment and purchasing materials. So for instance, I've been in discussion with our vendors. We have several print vendors that we utilize, that we have contracts with, that we should be able to purchase envelopes, ballot envelopes. So again, to the Secretary's point, regardless of what happens, we're going to see an expanded volume of absentee ballots coming in by mail. We'll need to make sure that the clerks have those resources ready at hand, and there is a potential lead time on the printing of those of 4 to 6 weeks. I have 2 different vendors giving me 2 different times, but my thought is we might be able to use them both and have one print a first tranche of envelopes and then rely on the other to provide us that last tranche before the clerks will ultimately need them to go out. We will also need to start the process on printing of extra ballots for our counties that are on non-paper systems. And then I'm going to make a request that the board allow me to start utilizing some of the HAVA funds, with the expectation that, one, some of the costs that we'll be spending on this will be able to be utilized as our match for the CARES funds, the STIMS funds that came out that the Secretary just requested. And thank you for that, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that as well. But if we start the process now on some of those counties that want ballot marking devices to be able to use for in-person voting in the election, we need to start that process now. The good thing is that all the equipment and materials that I'm suggesting that we need to start purchasing, with the exception of the postcard, all of these are equipment and materials that we can continue to use in the future, even if we decide not to pull the trigger on this plan or a similar plan. If the election goes in a different direction, or if the situation on the ground necessitates that there is not a process in which we'll be utilizing this equipment, we'll still be using the scanners, we'll be using the ballots, we'll be using envelopes. All those will be able to use into the future as we move forward. So my hope is that I can get a motion from someone on the board that would allow me and the staff to start to procure that information, or that materials, that equipment. We'll work closely with the Secretary and his staff, as well as the county clerks, to determine what that is. And I think it's also appropriate to mention, because some of the concerns we received from the clerk's offices were that they don't want to be forced equipment onto them. And I don't think that's what this is. I think there are counties that are actively requesting for equipment to be replaced, for equipment to be upgraded, and for some equipment to be able to help them facilitate in the processing of all these ballots that could be coming in a relatively quick time. So, this, even in requesting the board permission to start to release these funds to purchase the equipment and materials that we need, it's not by any means a note to the clerk saying that we're going to force you into using these things. It'll still be at the discretion of the county board and the county clerk to determine what systems they're utilizing, as long as they have the appropriate resources to be successful at the election. And we want to make sure we have the time frame in which to order those and get that up and ready.
Chairman Chandler, this is Renisa. May I have permission to speak, please?
Yes, Renisa, please do.
I just have a lot of concerns. It has to do with the timing and the lack of a plan. Because we can't wait until the last minute to implement this plan, alternate plan. It's just not feasible for us on our end to get this training of our election workers. That can't wait. There are some election training that is supposed to be scheduled for next week. That's obviously not going to happen. So it's just setting us up for failure if we don't have a clear, direct path and which way to go. And we need that really, really quickly. I mean, I hate to say that, we make or you all make a decision, and then, the decision puts us all in jeopardy because we don't have enough people or plans in place on election day for it to be successful. And we all want it to be successful. I just think it's very important to know that there are many things to be worked out. And it's just, the longer we wait, the more we risk not having a successful election. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. I think two things are really important here. One is what you just said. It's extremely important for us to try to have a successful election. I don't think anybody wants to set the clerks or anybody else up for failure. We don't want to be on the national news for having had an election that's a complete mess and thoroughly chaotic. We'd like to run a successful election. The second thing is that I believe it's very important, and the secretary mentioned this, and I appreciate it. It's very important that we come up with broad bipartisan agreement on how we move forward. We've got a statutory scheme now that requires the Secretary of State and the governor to prescribe the manner of the election. So it's very vital that the Secretary of State agree with the process that we want to undertake, and the governor also. If we have disagreement amongst those two, we're not going to get anywhere. The state board isn't in a position right now under the statutory scheme to be able to come up with a plan that can be followed until and unless the Secretary of State and the governor agree that this is a plan that we want to take moving forward. So really, to a large extent, Mr. Secretary, it's bounced over to you. You've got to decide when and how we need to go forward. We're trying to make a recommendation to you and to the governor. And we have put this recommendation forward, at least for discussion purposes. We're trying to get to a point where we can satisfy the county clerks and have a successful election, give them the time to make sure that they're successful. So I guess ultimately it would be my request that we do come up with some kind of a plan that we put in place sooner rather than later. I'd love to see it happen within the next week or two at least. Any comments on that?
I agree 100%. I think our window is narrowing. I don't think we can do this today. I don't think we're trying to do this today, but I agree 100%. We got to have finality and get moving. So I think Jared's 100% right to go ahead and start the process today on initial procurement. But it's obviously going to take some time for me to vet this with the governor. I don't think he and I are going to be very far apart. He's been great to work with on this stuff. So I think we're pretty close to yes.
Well, that's excellent. As you heard our Henderson County clerk say, it is important that we have a decision very, very soon. And unfortunately, we don't have the luxury. If we're going to have a successful election, we don't have the luxury to wait to see what the health situation is going to be in June. We have to pull the trigger relatively soon if we want to have a successful election.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, George, go ahead.
No, I was going to make the motion. You go ahead first.
Well, I do have one question for Katrina and James and Renisa especially. Just, your take. What I suggested is a slight modification of this plan. Would you think that would be under today's condition? And all of you obviously speak up, not just the clerks and former clerks, but would that be a workable position to have an expanded availability to vote absentee with that divided up at the voters' selection between voting by mail, which I think most would probably do, or expanded days of early voting, which would help enable release of the pressure to have so many people show up on one day, spread that out over, say, 15 or come up with whatever number of days. Would that be a way to realistically address the concerns that we have, but also not literally eliminate election day voting as a matter of law for 99% of the population?
Mr. Secretary, James. Yeah, I think it would. I think that time is an issue, but I'm assuming that clerks have already had their ballots printed for the most part. So that's one part of the aspect of the process that we will not have to start from a date forward. In other words, it's already in process. By expanding the medical emergency process, I think that in itself is very important. I think that's a good route to go on this issue, extending the amount of time that, of course, under current law, clerks can vote absentee in office as long as they want to, as they're required to do at least 12 days. But a lot of counties do 30 and 40 already. So I think we can go a little bit more conservatively as far as speed on this process. We do have over 2 months before the June 23rd date. So I would suggest we proceed with caution.
I would like to just say that the clerks as a group, right now, we are limiting in-person contact with the public. So that is something that we would want to try to continue to limit. So, you know, the original plan that we talked about in the working group was to offer that in-person voting just for those who are disabled, to use the machine with that capability, and also for people who, you know, may not have an address, maybe they're homeless or they don't have mail service. And that seemed like a more manageable number to, you know, we could control. It could be by appointment. We do not want to facilitate or encourage people to come to the office to vote and congregate. And, you know, it's just not something we think we can handle at this point. You know, limited would be something that we would be able to handle. But we would like to see as our group, a majority of the voting to be done through the mail with security in place.
I have to agree. This is Katrina. I agree with Renisa. Even if things change with the virus by election day, we're still not going to be at 100% where we can go and see everybody and shake hands. And I think absentee vote by appointment, like she had suggested, I think that's a good idea. Open up where anybody can come in and vote absentee in the office. I have a real concern over that for their employees, for the people coming in and standing outside and congregate, because you know nobody's going to walk in and do what they're going to do and leave. They don't. So I think it's safe if we continue on with what was discussed earlier, mail out the ballots, in-office voting by appointment. That's just my 2 cents.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, George.
I have not been a county clerk. However, I have worked with county clerks 30 years. If we have a dual system of voting, that's doubling the work on the county clerks. And we're starting something new. And we need to start soon on the process. I'm at the point where I would like to propose a motion to authorize the executive director to implement the purchases he thinks deemed necessary at this time to get this process started. So that is my motion.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Chairman Chandler, if I could,
Yes.
and with all due respect, George, I really appreciate the motion. I just want to make sure that the motion is specific to the fact that we're still waiting for a process in accordance with the secretary and the governor and that executive order. But as long as I have the ability to start the procurement process and some of these things, knowing that ultimately I'm procuring materials and equipment specific to the election, and that elections in the future will also be able to utilize that equipment, and that way we're not hemming anyone in from either the secretary side or the governor's side. But I think, hearing from the secretary directly today, obviously there's an interest in moving forward expediently, and I want to make sure that we do that. But I just want to make sure the motion also reflects that, if I could. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Exactly.
Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, yes.
I was going to say, Jared, that would be pretty much what you outlined in what was sent to the board yesterday from a procurement standpoint. Am I correct?
It would. I think the only thing that, like I said, the only thing here that would keep us, that we would not be able to use in the future would be the postcard, the notification postcard. We have a little extra time. To me, the biggest lead time that we have is on the envelopes. And that's also probably the most important thing that we could provide, because if the envelopes aren't there, then we can't mail out anything. The postcard is something we can work on and even potentially split up among vendors. My hope is that, I can order that in a couple of weeks and still have the time to get it out appropriately. And that will give the governor and the secretary the time to do their side of this. But Renisa, to your point, I think, in making the board making this motion, allowing us to procure equipment and materials, it also gives direction to the county clerks, knowing that these resources will be available to you, and that, you're not going to get caught off guard with this. Now, there are some things that you might have to postpone for a couple of days to determine whether or not you have, training coming in and that sort of situation. But my feeling is both from the board and the secretary that this will be an expedited process, but that we'll get word to the clerks. But if we can have the equipment purchased, I think the clerks can rest easy that, the resources that they will need will be there.
Right. And to my point is that if we can go ahead, I'm willing to second George's motion, because we actually have a law that hasn't been signed in to law yet. It's waiting, and hopefully will be soon, but it's not there yet. But I think it would be very wise of us to go ahead and start the procurement process, because the extra ballots, et cetera, those things, really, whether we're passing a, largely absentee voting, purely absentee voting, either way, we're going to have more absentee voting in this cycle than we've ever had. So we need to be prepared for that. And to that end, I second George's motion.
All right, we have a motion and we have a second. Thank you, Deanna. In a perfect world, I think we'd love to see this this motion pass, and then hopefully the secretary and the governor within the next couple of weeks, in working with the board and the staff, can come to a conclusion and actually have a plan in place that the clerks can rely on. And Mr. Secretary, you have heard the concerns of the clerks, I think, right now. It would be great if we could work toward finalizing a plan in, say, the next couple of weeks, with the idea that we can move forward with the things that need to be done, those procurement items that need to be undertaken in the meantime, to make sure that we don't close out this option, essentially. Is there any more discussion on this particular motion?
Can I just respond to that real fast? I get it. I
Yes.
agree 100%. And my own timeline is going to be, I certainly want to have prior to the board's next scheduled meeting on the 21st, all these ducks in a row.
Great. Well, I think that would be perfect if we looked at that time frame. If we could be able to finalize something at the next regular board meeting, that would, I think, be great. Now, wonderful. Thank you. This motion is on the floor to allow Jared to start the procurement process of those things needed to make sure that this election and this method of election can be successful if we determine to go that way. Is there any more discussion on the motion?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes. Dwight.
Jared, you sent out a copy of this itemized list of potential costs.
Yeah.
I'm curious, the PPE and the cleaning supplies, what exactly are those supplies intended for? Are those intended for every clerk, every location? What exactly are we looking at? Because I know resources to find those items are pretty tough right now.
So that's one of the things that is one of those items that partly why I don't think it's necessarily about this plan. It's more about how do we affect any successful election moving forward into the current conditions. And that is equipment that we'll need regardless of what we will finalize on. So in that sense, what we're talking about is in some locations, it might be helping clerks buy plexiglass to put in front of, their customer service window. That if they don't have a customer service window, they might just have a counter. So how are we helping them provide some level of security to have that the aerosolization of the virus out into the air, keeping that from away from the thing. Also masks. We're providing masks. Are we providing hand sanitizer? We might need to procure something as simple as providing pens. If we buy pens for the entire County Clerks Association, they're not having to worry about cleaning those pens. They can literally give a brand new pen to every voter that comes in and have them take it away with them. That would include having that transmission through materials that they're passing from voter to voter. It also include cleaning equipment for the election equipment that we currently have. You can't just kind of pour bleach on those things and call it a day. It's some of them are pretty sophisticated in electronic systems that you've got to clean in a very specific way, and there have been guidelines set out by the vendors that will help us with that. But when we're talking about PPE specifically, we're talking about hand sanitizer, masks, gloves, and then some of that side equipment that will help create barriers of transmission.
And the numbers that you provided, Jared, are estimates. Is that correct?
Very much estimates. Part of the problem that we're going to have right now is, especially with PPE, when we're procuring it, there's not a lot out on the market right now. So we're going to have to start placing orders for that. And quite frankly, we don't necessarily know how much of an order we need to place. So this might be something that we build a connection with either I know the governor has reached out to the distilleries, and I will say to bring Karen into the conversation as well. Karen, even though she's brand new to this job, she's already providing us a lot of benefit. She reached out to a friend of hers, as the board I'm sure will remember. She worked at Alcohol Beverage Control prior to this position. And so she reached out to a friend of hers at the Distillers Association, and they are letting us know that while the governor is definitely procuring the majority of those equipments to be able to use for hospitals, there will be a set aside for us for the purposes of the election itself. So hand sanitizer, I don't think we're going to have a huge problem with. We just need to make sure that order is available to them and they know we're going to need it. But gloves and masks, that sort of thing, we're going to have to catch as catch can. But I'm confident that we'll do everything we can to get it and procure it and do so in a meaningful and timely way.
Great. Thank you. Dwight, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Dwight.
Does it any other discussion on the motion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Are there any nays?
All right, we have a unanimous vote on the motion. I appreciate it very much. Jared, you now have the authority. The motion passes and you have the authority of the board to move forward with the procurement necessary to put this plan in place.
Thank you.
Now, that being said, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you again for all the work that you've done on this and for your willingness to try to come to some kind of an agreement with the governor before April 21st, so we can finalize the plans and have a plan in place for the county clerks who've got to carry this program out. That's extremely important, I think, for us to have a successful election. Is there any other business that needs to be taken up today? All right.
If you're asking me, no, I don't believe there is. I think the special meeting was solely for the purpose of having a general discussion and being able to help support the governor and the secretary in their task moving forward.
Very good. With that, I will thank everybody for their participation and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Deanna. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Second by Sherry. Thank you all very much and look forward to seeing you on the 21st.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.